Thank you very much for coming, everybody. And whilst people do carry on getting coffees, etc., because I was going to sort of give a welcome to people and also to welcome to those who've joined us online. I mean, I don't actually know quite everyone who's going to be online, but at some point during the day, there's going to be up to 70 joining us online, and so it's a very good sort of welcome to a very early morning in Canada to Lena and Lisa across Canada, and to Tracy who's joining us in the US, and it's good evening to Ruth and Alex and others in Australia. Good afternoon to Bahara in Tehran and Hannah in Saudi Arabia, and sort of good mid-morning to most of the people in the UK and various places in between. And also for the people online, you'll see that I put my email address up there because this session is really going to continue over lunch. That's if I stop talking by then, which is unlikely. But there will therefore be a chance for people to exchange ideas. But obviously, if there's any questions you have and not had a chance to ask them in the relatively brief question session, then do just send me an email and I'll try and answer at some point. And so we're here to talk about whether it's worth spending money on medical research, and also really celebrating 30 years since Martin Buxton and I started the Payback Framework. But I'll just start with some introduction of what it is I hope to cover today. And at the moment, it's not moving on. So I'll start talking because the first slide, it talks about the context of the Payback Framework. So it didn't just materialize from nothing. So there's there were certain ideas and of collaboration and impact implementation that influenced the Payback Framework, and also the context of having to enhance the research budget, justify the research budget. And the Payback Framework, I'm going to explain, it's a comprehensive way to assess research impact, combining both traditional impacts and wider impacts. Key word there is combining. So we didn't say that you should put emphasis on the policy impacts, on the practice impacts, instead of the traditional academic impacts. It was an addition. And I think that's been one of the keys to why it's been widely applied. And for those people who've seen the slides about Payback Framework before, apologies, because others haven't seen them. And I don't think anyone has seen this whole presentation before. I certainly haven't. So we're looking at three topics in particular, were areas that over the 30 years we've concentrated on developing. There's been some pioneering bibliometric approaches, which have been led by Terry Jones there, and there's a poster talking about that, and Terry will be able to explain some of the things she was doing in relation to the poster over lunch. And then there's been the value of the health gain, which is very much the work of health economists like Martin and Matthew Glover, who's hopefully going to join us at some point, Steve Morris, and I just try to not look too stupid when those are discussed. But that has led on, because one of the key things about looking at the value of it, it's not only be able to show the value, but identify how the value came about, what could increase the value, and the issue then of time lags became very central. And so we looked at how you might be able to reduce time lags and produce a matrix to analyze that. And that came in very handy when trying to analyze what happened during COVID. And then finally, we've also focused on looking at the use of evidence in policy making, for example, a paper to WHO I talk about. So our work has certainly informed a further advance of impact assessments, and I'll show how it seem to inform the REF in some ways, and also it's fitted in with and linked in with WHO's focus on health research systems. And again, that's been relevant for during COVID. And then Bryony is going to reflect on how the Department of Health saw this payback work and the context in which it was taking place. I'm also going to talk about one of the areas that was originally part of the payback framework that we never had time to look at properly, and that was whether or not clinicians who are research active, healthcare organizations that are research active, produce better outcomes. And of course, many collaborators have helped over the years, some led projects and papers. I'll mention some, but won't have time to mention everyone, but obviously they're all most valuable contributions, and grateful for all the people I've worked with, brilliant people often. And the session will continue over lunch. As I said, there's various posters here. Some of the researchers are here, and there's various papers put out. People are interested. Right, so this is a journey today. 4 centuries in some ways. We go back to 1627, to the New Atlantis by Francis Bacon, and from that to Brunel, and this afternoon we'll see the actual launch of a new agreement between Brunel and WHO. And Francis Bacon told this story of being on board a ship in the middle of the ocean, and suddenly a storm blew up, a terrible, terrible storm. They had no idea where they were and what was happening. And then suddenly they found themselves on a previously unknown island. And that was the basis of his description, obviously it's a fictional description of this utopian society. Now, Francis Bacon, he was one of the founders of the scientific method. The idea that you should do science, do experiments, and that should be the basis of knowledge. He was convinced that this was the right thing to do, so much so that it killed him. He was doing an early experiment one day, lying out with a chicken in some snow, something to do with see whether he could freeze it. And he caught a cold and sadly died. But he nevertheless was one of the founders, recognized one of the founders of the scientific method. And so he describes this island, which is which the science community, science college, played a really important role for society's benefits. And there were different groups of scientists, and their role was described by someone from the scientific college. And he said that there were various teams of scientists they had. Some collected experiments by traveling to other countries. Some went through books and collected experiments. Some collected the experiments of practical fields. And we have 3 that try new experiments, such as themselves think good. A 5th group draw the experiments of the former 4 into titles and tables to give better light and drawing of observations and axioms out of them. We call these the compilers. So who knew that systematic reviewers were around 4 centuries ago? And then there's a crucial thing for us anyway today, the crucial thing. We have 3 looking into the experiments of their fellows and cast about to draw out of them things of use and value for man's practical life. Now, this is the key point of talking about this, because often people who look at impact are told, perhaps, especially in the early days, oh, that's not what science is about. But you can point them to the founder of the scientific method 4 centuries ago, who was there saying the impact of research is one of the things that matters. So we have referred to this long history, but of course, the strongest tradition in science usually belongs to research freedom and academic quality. So 40 years ago today, Maurice Kogan and Mary Henkel, I'm delighted that Mary's joined us today, did a groundbreaking report of government and research. Maurice, I think Maurice would be delighted. It was 50 years ago, he made the first bid for Brunel to get a medical school. He led that bid, which was not successful then, but he's very pleased to see that it's come about now. Now, at this time, there was a move 40 years ago, 50 years ago, there was a move to say, well, look, all this research from the research councils, it's all very well, but it's not necessarily meeting the needs of government departments of society. So the Rothschild experiment took place in the 1970s, in which some money was taken from the research councils and given to government departments. It took place across government, but Kogan and Henkel focused on the health department and evaluated a prospective evaluation of the 7 years implementation of this in the 1970s, and then wrote the findings up in this book. And they argued really groundbreaking work for 40 years ago that what was important was the collaborative approach to setting agendas for healthcare research, and the use of knowledge brokers and policymakers as receptors, the body to receive and use research, and the permeability of the interfaces between research and society. You'll see these ideas crop up regularly. Now, by about the about 2005 or so, many more people were recognizing that these ideas were important. So I said to Maurice and Mary, perhaps we should do a 2nd edition, because many more people now are talking about the sorts of things that you were talking about. And so at that time also, probably the world's leading expert on evidence to policy was Jonathan Lomas from Canada. And he very kindly wrote this in the 2nd edition about the 1st edition. You can see, finally, the rest of the world has caught up with Kogan and Henkel. 25 years ago, their groundbreaking study of the UK's Department of Health R&D led them to conclude that sustained interactions between scientists and bureaucrats was the way to unleashing the value of science for policy process. I found the first edition of this book, so that's this one, the single most compelling and comprehensive treatment of this complex interaction. They can take their rightful place as precursors and leaders of what has become a mass movement for evidence-based policy. So that was the context. And so they analysed, Morris and Mary analysed the implementation. And of course, MRC and leading scientists didn't like the fact they'd lost money and were against it. And there were other problems, such as how could policymakers actually find the time to set the policy, to set the agendas for research. And so by about 1980, the initiative had fizzled out. But of course, they didn't do anything to get rid of the problem that it was set up to address, which was the feeling that a lot of health research, in this instance, was not sufficiently relevant to meeting the health needs of the society. And Brian is going to be talking more about this later on. So this led then to a new NHS R&D strategy in 1991, intended to meet the needs of the NHS. And it was partly informed by Kogan and Henkel. Crucially, they got new money this time. But of course, that did mean that the NHS R&D director needed to show the Treasury that he was analysing impact. He wasn't naive enough to think that we could do impact studies to show the impact of the programme he'd only just set up, but he could show the Treasury that we had ways, that they had funded an attempt to identify ways to show the impact in future and to do studies to try and show the impact of some previous health research. And so he funded Martin, and Martin asked me to join him to look at how to assess payback. And we developed the Payback Framework and worked with the Department of Health. And Chris Henshaw has described this. And I think Chris is joining us online. Unfortunately, Chris was going to join us, but is not so well today. And also we talked, obviously, Morris and Mary helped us develop this. And the point is that the Payback Framework integrates this collaborative approach into it. It consists of two main elements. So a multidimensional categorization of benefits. They say a crucial thing, it was academic and wider impacts. And then there's also a model. It's a model for assessing impacts. It's going to look, it is linear. People are going to think, oh, that's not how research actually feeds into policymaking. But this is a model for assessing research impact, not for necessarily saying how the impact has arisen. Oh, so what are the categories? So there's knowledge production, traditionally methods of assessing that by articles, citation, etc. And then say Terry developed this in various ways. It was pretty relevant for some of the wider impacts. Future research, so targeting of future research. So often one of the results of a piece of research is that it identifies what would be useful for further research to do, building research capacity. And then you see I've underlined absorption and use. And this is because we recognize that it was a good benefit from research to have research in a system, in say a healthcare system, which might mean that you are more likely to absorb research findings from others into your healthcare system. But we never really made much progress on looking at the absorption or use. And Brian is going to explain how subsequently we did able to develop that field. Then, of course, informing policies is important. It's very messy, diverse, clinical policies, public policies. You'll see I keep emphasizing that there are very different mechanisms for these different areas. And that was very relevant when we come on to look at COVID. And also informing product development. Then what's often seen as the key impacts, impact on health and health sector benefits, and then the broader economic benefits. And then the model helps to look, is for looking at where you assess the impacts, how to identify one project's contribution from other research and other factors, and has 7 stages. Now, crucially, the research is sort of in the middle of the system, and you have the wider society and the wider stock of knowledge both before and after, and of course increasingly people recognize it's important to look at that as things are going on. And then the interfaces between the wider society and the research system are very important. And so this is the our model, which we developed over the years, and as you can see, actually this this particular version was in 2003, in which Maurice joined Martin and I in doing some work for WHO. And this really sets out this idea that you have the research in the middle of the wider system. And so it's the topics are identified as a result of inputs from the wider society and, of course, from the stock of knowledge. Then there's the interface when topics are chosen. Then you get the various research, the inputs, the research processes, and the outputs, and the traditional impacts or results from research are at this stage 3, the primary outputs. So this is where you get the production of articles. Here, production of articles, which are of course fed back into the stock of knowledge, training of researchers who might go back and do future research, also the creation of points that need further clarification in future research, but also, but then these findings also feed as they are disseminated. So there might be what we call the secondary outputs. So the policy making or product development, we take a very broad definition of policy making. So it includes the clinical policies, clinical guidelines, as well as perhaps larger public policies. And so those we call the secondary outputs. And now, as you can see, we're now beginning to get into the categories of impact. This is the third one, policy impact. And then those feed into adoption by public. And then you get the final impacts of the health gain and the economic benefits. But of course, it doesn't always happen like that. Sometimes you get the products produced, the research produced, and leading clinicians read the journals and think, oh, these are really good, this is a really good intervention. And then they might encourage the Royal Colleges and others in their field to produce guidelines on it to get it adopted more widely. So there's all sorts of lines here. It's complicated. But this is, sorry, I'm told I'm being signed out. I don't know.
No, you're still here. We still hear you and we still see you.
Oh, good. Okay, thanks. This is how we applied it then. So first of all, we did one-off case studies. So in a series of them, I'll just mention one example there, to the work of Isabel Allen on the careers of women doctors. And this had considerable impact on a specific policies, but it's also a very good example of where you obviously also have to think about the whole contribution to wider changes, because the work of Isabel, although it made some impact on specific policies, is no way responsible for the general move towards, which is still going on, recognition of the need to do things to improve the prospects for the careers of women doctors. And that was one-off case studies, but then as the framework developed, as it applied more often, we also did surveys. And the key thing about the payback framework is that this applied a structure for all our methods. So we use the stages of the payback framework in the interview schedules we did, in the surveys we did, in the interview schedules, in our documentary analysis, and then how we wrote it up. So all our payback case studies within a program have a common structure, and across programs they also had this common structure. I think that's been very important. And the interviews we did were always semi-structured. So we were a lot of triangulation here. We would look at the surveys, see if researchers had suggested they influenced certain things, and we'd look at documents. And then when we went to do the interviews, we would elaborate on that. Sometimes we found additional things that the researchers didn't know they'd made an impact. And we did try scoring the impact we got from surveys with the impact from the case studies on those projects where we did case studies as well as surveys. And what we found was actually generally broadly similar. So researchers were not, from our evidence, exaggerating on average the impact in the survey. Of course, in our work, there was no monetary benefit for them or anything. But nevertheless, it was interesting. And we focused on two types of questions, really. We had the importance of the research to a particular policy. So say with the guideline, was it something that was cited often and in the key parts of the guideline? And then we looked at the level at which the impact was made. Now, was it just local policy or was it global? And so that could be seen as reach. And so the whole point about a lot of the work we were doing, examining the context So, examining the wider context and looking at the processes all helps to explore the degree of attribution or contribution that's relevant and help to identify factors associated with achieving impact. So, for example, if researchers had talked to potential users before they did a piece of research, well, and then the users, policymakers seem to be informed by that research, well, you've then got a connection which suggests that maybe that piece of work was what influenced the policies that were made. Then these wider impacts, of course, are not always achieved. I fear sometimes some systems these days are trying to say all research has got to achieve a wider impact. Well, that's nonsense. It can't achieve a wider impact. Otherwise, it probably wouldn't be research anymore if everything was going to produce a wider impact. Some things will, and as we're going to see later, some of them dramatically produce enormous levels of impact, which helps pay for the whole system. But there was growing interest in assessing research impact. So we applied it to various programs, and it's still the most widely used according to systematic review, in which Matthew and I worked with James Rafferty and Trish Brunel. But of course, there are an increasing number of other frameworks. Now, one of the posters up there talks about the examples where we applied it to the work of some medical research charities. I mean, most of our funders were public bodies, but we also looked at medical research charities, and it did help them greatly to be able to show the benefits of their research to the people who'd worked so hard to raise money for them. And also, it helped to inform their strategies. So examples were the Arthritis Research Campaign. Arthritis Research changed its name several times, but and also Asthma UK and the National Breast Cancer Foundation of Australia. And I look a little bit at that particular study. So it was fairly typical in that we surveyed all the PIs, 153 responses, 63%. We had 16 case studies selected through purposely stratified selection, and the case studies were done by interviews, documentary analysis, etc. And there was also a major bibliometric analysis. And this was Claire Donovan was leading our team on this particular project. The results were the academic impacts were very strong publications, double the world average for citation rates. 70 surveys reported career progression, 185 higher degrees, 66 reported that they built tools for future research, and there were further grants. And the wider impacts, one of the problems was, and this is quite often a problem, that we were commissioned to do this work quite early in the funding of the overall programme. So quite a few of the studies would not realistically have had much chance to make a wider impact. But nevertheless, there were some very important wider impacts. So 16 grants impacted on policy, 14 led to devices, drugs, diagnostic tools, 22 led to changes in practice, further were expected, and some of the case studies were of high impact. Now, because, as I said, it was very important to medical research charities in particular to show their work has been an impact, to show the people who raised the money. Then we looked at the dissemination, and the dissemination in this case was particularly strong. So you see, they managed to get often to audiences over 1 million. This is in Australia. So 5 TV stories, 7 newspaper articles, 21 radio interviews, 17 online items. And so this illustrates the importance of medical research charities, a point attached to assessing impact. And one of the posters shows also some of the news stories, coverage that this attracted. Now, why did they manage to get quite so much coverage? Well, this is one example. This was the Australian Online. It was also in the print version. And you see there the chief executive officer on the right and the patron on the left. And they both really mastered the key findings. We heard interviews they did, and they both put over the findings really well. So you can imagine that would have attracted further interviews. And the study, Claire did a very good job in producing a robust study. But perhaps to be fair, there was also one other reason that may have had some impact on the coverage we got. And that led to this what seemed to me a rather bizarre comment, which is the final sentence of down here of this story, which says, NBC patron Sarah Murdoch, so it does help if your father owns all the media, father-in-law owns all the media, said, we had all our fingers and toes crossed. It would be a positive result. So it was clearly mattered to them. And as I say, you know, what we heard the interviews she did, she really did get on top of what we said in the findings. So this shows how much it matters to medical research charities to be able to have studies done. And as I say, there's lots of coverage up there. Now, we didn't do many studies of our own work, but there's particular reasons why, especially if we're celebrating our work, that I thought we'd talk about one case study on work that had been done by her. This is by a study led by Martin on abdominal aortic aneurysms, which time it started, 80% of men died if their aortic aneurysm ruptured. And in the UK at this time, when the research started, that was 6,800 men dying annually. So any evidence to the National Screening Committee, and going back to Kogan and Henkel, National Screening Committee in the UK was a classic example of a receptor body, a research receptor body. They were there waiting for research results to come out, and then they could use them, incorporate them into policies. And it would, it'd reduce deaths in a significant way. This is particularly because abdominal aortic aneurysms are generally asymptomatic. So the first most people know they've got one is when it ruptures, or severe one is when it ruptures, and that is very, very bad news. Now, if you're a bit squeamish, you might want to look away at this stage, because this illustrates what I'm talking about, an abdominal aortic aneurysm, and you really don't want one of these. So I'll move on to the next slide and show the exceptional impact that this did achieve. And I do stress this is exceptional. We're not saying this is what regularly happens with studies, but it does show how you can look at impact occurring across all 5 categories. So lots of articles were produced, for example, in the Lancet, and this team's studies constituted over 75% of the weight of evidence reviewed internationally. So that's one of the reasons why it made such an impact. If you have 75% of the impact from one study, then it's likely that that is going to be make an impact. Then if it's something that it seems to be appropriate to use, which was in this stage. Then targeted future research, extending it to screening to females. The prevalence amongst females was much lower. That's why the focus was on males to start with. And also research training. So that Matthew Glover, who's there in a few weeks, is going to get your PhD, aren't you? Congratulations. And part of that by publication, and some of the publications were based on this AAA work and some of it on the payback stream. Then informed policies, so this is crucial. The National Screening Committee were really waiting for this. In fact, I think they encouraged the team to get on and produce their findings as rapidly as possible because they wanted to use them. And then it was announced by the Prime Minister in January 2008, Prime Minister Gordon Brown. Now, this wasn't just any old announcement. This was very important to him because this speech was his speech celebrating, got the years right, celebrating the 60th anniversary of the founding of the NHS. So it really mattered to him, and he wanted some big announcements to make in it. And announcing the introduction of AAA screening was one of the big announcements that Gordon Brown wanted to use. And that's also influence of official guidelines in the US and Sweden, and surgeons' guidelines in the US and Europe, and in Congress. As you know, Congress will often, particularly Republicans, try and restrict the amount of coverage provided by Medicare. So you actually have to have a new act of Congress if you want to extend coverage. So they had an act called, bizarrely, SAVE, Screening for Abdominal Aortic Aneurysms Very Efficiently. So it improved health. So implemented in 2009 in England, 300,000 of us are annually called at 65, and approximately 75 of us accept. And the Department of Health estimated that over 20 years, it might result in a health gain of 130,000 QALYs. That's quality adjusted life years. Now, in fact, it's turned out that perhaps the prevalence has dropped a bit, so the health gain hasn't quite been as much as that. But nevertheless, that was what they estimated at the time. And then they translated that into an enormous economic impact just from one piece of work, or a series of studies on this, of 3.8 billion UK pounds. Anyway, that's an example of just the impact that might come from one study. So then people were keen for us to try and see if we could look at the overall economic impact of the whole field of research. Now, this involves lots and lots of steps. So I'm going to start with just the ones, and there are lots in just doing this, that were done primarily in HERG before moving on to look at the steps that were done by our collaborators. And so this was to see whether or not you could assess the net value of the health gain from research. And this was the report, Buxton et al., medical research, what's it worth? It was published by the funders, so that's Wellcome Trust, MRC, the Academy of Medical Sciences, and NIHR, and the team, so this is, in this case, this is particularly Martin and Steve Morris at this stage, were reviewed the literature to produce figures for the QALYs per patient for over 40 different specific research interventions. So things like the use of statins. So this was a new intervention during this period of 1985 to 2005 that had come about as a result of research. And so an enormous amount of work going to identify the health gain from these. Then for each intervention, they multiplied these figures by the number of new users each year. Very complicated. I do things like adjusting for compliance rates, et cetera, et cetera. And that led to an estimated total quality gain for each. Then this had to be monetized, very horrible term, but anyway, monetize the total quality gain by using the NICE, that's the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, or Health and Clinical Excellence, figure of £25,000 per quality. Now, this is based on the midpoint of normal criteria used for acceptance of interventions by NICE. There's an enormous amount of debate about this, but anyway, this is the figure for simplification. This is the figure we used. And then the literature was used. Of course, you've got all this health gain, but it costs something. It doesn't just appear. You've got to actually provide the interventions to get this health gain. And so it was important to look at the incremental costs associated with each intervention, multiply by the number of users to end up with the cost of delivering the interventions that led to all this health gain, and combine this for a figure of the net monetary benefit. Now, as if that wasn't complicated enough, that is only one of the 4 things that had to be done. All those things were just one of the 4 things that had to be done. The others had to work out how much money had been spent on the research to start with, look at the time lags, because of course, a benefit that comes immediately is worth more than if you have to wait years and years to get the benefit. And so it's important to look at the time lags, because the Treasury says you have to discount, and then they were saying by 3.5% per year. And then the benefits we were looking at were from research, not specifically in this study from UK research. So it was important to identify what proportion of all these impacts actually came from UK research. And so how was this done? Well, the team, and here I've referred to, I'm sorry, in the previous slide, I referred to some of the other people in the overall team. So Rand Europe did a lot of the work, Office of Health Economics in this first study, Policy Institute at King's in the later studies, and the people at Rand in particular worked out how much had been spent on each of these over the years 1975 to 92. And then they looked at UK cardiovascular disease guidelines to estimate percentage of the research gain that could be attributed to UK research. Slightly complicated, but this also came out as 17%. 17 seems to crop up all the time. Anyway, so 17% of the papers on the UK guidelines seem to cite UK research. And then what was the elapsed time, or the time lag between the research and its implementation? Well, we found on average it was 9.5 years between the publication of the papers and their citation on the guidelines. But then we had to added on 7.5 years, because this covered the time when, whilst the research is going on, so you get the funding, but then of course you had to do the research, and then of course you had to produce the publications, and then also, once the guidelines are issued, there's going to be some delay before implemented. And of course, I know guideline implementation itself is a whole complicated field, but we have to allow some time for that. So we came up with this 17 years. For which is informed by discounting. Now, 17 years, various studies have been done using all sorts of different methods, different starting points, different ending points, and they all seem to come up with the idea that it took 17 years. It really was quite sort of spooky that different people came up using different methods for the same idea of 17 years. But it was important, and so to calculate the rate of return, internal rate of return was calculated and found to be 9% for the health gain, 10% for the health gain for a later study that was done by on cancer, and the Cancer Research UK were one of the funders, and then 7% for the musculoskeletal disease, which was part funded by the Arthritis Research UK. Of course, slightly lower figure because most of the benefits in the arthritis field are from reduced morbidity, some reduced mortality, but not nearly to the same extent. And also, the biggest single factor in both the cardiovascular and the cancer rate of return were the reduction in smoking. So research that led to smoking cessation had made the biggest contribution, and that was relatively less important in musculoskeletal disease area. So that's only part of it, however. And the Office of Health Economics were doing the work, and then it was revised to suggest that there's also a benefit that comes. So if you're doing public research, charitable research, this spills over and helps to keep in the UK companies doing research and company research, and that employs people, has all sorts of benefits. So in fact, the spillover benefits are greater than the initial than the health gain benefits. And when you put them all together, it comes to this: every £1 invested in medical research delivers a return equivalent to around 25 pence per year forever. And that was our conclusion. Only a couple of weeks ago, it was cited by Academy of Medical Sciences. It was on radio. So in terms of how you work out what the result is, the key thing, there are lots of caveats, of course, lots of factors that can come in, into this calculation. And so the way we measure things, if you measure it in a slightly different way, maybe there would be a different rate of return. And in particular, the time lags is very important. So if the time lags were in fact longer, then the rate of return would be less. If, however, you could reduce the time lags, then the benefit increases. And so the MRC funded us to do some work to try and see what caused time lags, how might you reduce them. And this was a paper that we did, and this particular matrix, so it's very much thanks to Chris Henshaw. He had drafted the original version of this, but then got written up rather more to produce this. The lime green, the research tracks, various research tracks, going through the various phases. You have to go through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 of the trial, the original basic research. And then the olive green, these are the various non-research tracks where there's going to be sort of regulatory approval of the new drug, and then policy announcements that it's going to be used, or guidelines and reimbursement decisions. So this enabled us to start beginning to think about, and the crucial thing is, look, some of these things can be done in parallel. And that enabled us to develop some ideas, and most of this comes from Jonathan Grant and myself, the ideas about how you might speed things up. Put more resources in, then you can obviously usually do things more quickly. You can improve the processes, work in parallels, just been looking through the matrix, and you take more financial risk. The reason I say it's a financial risk is because the later stages of the research, they are larger. The phase 3 trials are much larger than the first ones. So therefore, they're more expensive. So normally companies wait until they're absolutely certain before moving on through the stages. It's risky to do things in parallel. Now, as so often, Martin came up with a key concept in all of this, and that is a concept of queues. Because when you look at research that made such an impact, you might think, well, why on the earth didn't they really speed on with that piece of research? Well, why did it take so long? But what Martin was saying is, you've got to think back to the time when it was being done. At the time, then maybe the researchers came up with this brilliant idea, but all sorts of other researchers who had brilliant ideas, and they're all saying, fund me, fund me, fund me. And so you had joined a queue of people who wanted funding. And that goes on throughout the whole system. A queue of people who want ethics approval as rapidly as possible for their study. A queue of people who want regulatory approval as rapidly as possible. And so it goes on. Queues are very important. Now, this approach, though, that we looked at, of course, developed because it became very useful when we tried to analyze what was going on with COVID and development of vaccines. And so you see, we produced this article in 2020, so in June 2020. So this was before the vaccines had been finalized, and we were speculating there maybe it would be reduced from 19 months to, instead of 19 years. 17 months instead of 17 years. And of course, that was an underestimate of how rapidly it occurred. But you could apply all of these to what was going on. Massive resources, as people probably know, in the US with Operation Warp Speed. These processes, now it's very interesting, processes have been going on for years and years. Teams of scientists have been working to develop in Oxford the platform that they then applied to the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, and particularly with the mRNA vaccines. That work had been going on for years and years and years. And often the researchers who are doing it have been told by Nobel Prize winners, this is nonsense. But they persevered with it, often at the expense of their own careers. And it was more or less at the point when, fortunate for society, it could be applied to improve process, and then working in parallel. So a lot of these trials went on in parallel, and of course, because there were more resources, they were able to take the financial risk to some extent was reduced for quite a few of the companies because the governments were providing so much money, but they definitely did things in parallel. So I think our framework there helped to expand, and of course, in COVID, the queues disappeared. Other research wasn't going on, so there wasn't a problem with getting waiting for ethical review. There weren't problems so it wasn't that the regulators skimped on approving the vaccines. It was that they could start early, focus all their efforts on the vaccines, because there wasn't anything else that was going on for them that they were allowed to do. So therefore, the queues disappeared almost entirely in this context. Just very briefly, sorry, I'm running out of time, but we're celebrating our own work, what impact did we make? Well, the UK was moving, so we go from 1993, 17 years, 2010. What was going on in 2010? Well, in the UK, developing what's called the Research Excellence Framework. This is a new way of assessing the research of all UK university departments. And they decided they would look at impact, not the impact of everyone's research, not the impact of all projects, but some projects they would look at the impact of. And they told the House of Commons, anyway, the people who developed it, that they drew heavily on the evidence. This is for all subjects, remember. They only came up, actually, mentioned in this report, two specific pieces of evidence. One was M. Buxton and S. Hanney's work using the Payback Framework, and the other was medical research, what's it worth? So it does seem as if perhaps this had some influence on the way in which they decided to implement the ideas of impact assessment. And they went on to say that they weren't going to look at the work of all individual academics, but to demonstrate impact by selection. Now, much further work was done on this by, again, Jonathan Grant, and drew on earlier proposals in Australia. This was when Claire Donovan was in Australia. So the importance of REF and other impact assessments is it provides evidence to support research funding, and also provides researchers with incentives to spend time on producing impact when they could be doing all the other pressures on. Now, one other example, what else was going on in 2010? Well, of course, it was couple of years after the global economic crisis. There was an election in UK in June 2010. It was absolutely clear, had Labour won the election, the budget of Alistair Darling was severe cuts to many public services, just as the coalition government then introduced. It was widely assumed that research would suffer quite severe cuts. Everyone was expecting that. However, political circumstances meant that the business department, which is where at that time the science budget was held, were able to save one of their budgets from cuts. So that was political reason, nothing to do with our work. So when they looked at what in their budget they might save, it does seem as if maybe our work might have helped influence that. Certainly this is a letter to Jonathan Grant from the science minister at the time, that does say that a report is regarded by biz analysts, that's the business department, as comprehensive and rigorous. It was used as evidence as part of the preparations for the spending review and will continue to be cited. So as we're now talking about the policy areas, and this is the final set of slides I've got, is on how we worked with the WHO. And this really sets up this afternoon's session as well. And so at this time, the WHO, going back to the early 2000s, WHO had this initiative called Knowledge for Better Health. They are very keen that evidence research should be used to improve health systems. And we were invited to join them because of our work on assessing the impact of research. But it soon became clear that our ideas could actually help the initiative more widely. And I say our ideas, but also going back to the ideas of Morris and Mary, because this idea was that knowledge was important for improving health systems, but that each country should have its own health research system. Why? Because it's thought that research that is being informed by the people in the local country is more likely to be relevant for the needs of the local country. So this collaboration on setting priorities comes up again. And this was one of the things that was driving WHO, as well as the recognition, I mean, Susanne, our view that if you're doing research, you're more likely to be able to absorb research. So Maurice Kogan joined Martin and I and Miguel in this paper. And basically, this was the paper on policy for this whole initiative. And again, emphasizing research use varies with type of policy, factors influencing use, includes the priority setting and the role of the receptors. And by this time, so this is sort of 2005, sorry, this is about 2004 time, 2003, lots more researchers were recognizing that, yes, they want to talk to policymakers. They want their research to make an impact. It just seemed to me that maybe we could sum this up by rewriting perhaps, arrogant as I am, the first sentence of Pride and Prejudice. And so this is what Jane Austen really meant, an alternative opening. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single researcher in possession of a good finding must be in want of a policymaker. So no, that's little known that Jane Austen said that, but it sums up the attitude at the time. But of course, that is somewhat wrong because a single researcher talking to a policymaker is often not going to be able to achieve the impact that's wanted, because all our work, Maurice Mary's work, our work on Payback suggests that you need to look more widely at systems here if you want the. So what goes on with setting the priorities, etc. And so another part of WHO's initiative was linked to health research systems. A new journal was created, which had this logo of the globe, which comes from WHO, and the candle. So where does the candle come from? And in this quote, you know, it was particularly, I used to use this during the time of Trump to remind ourselves that some US presidents previously were capable of inspirational thinking. So he who receives an idea from me receives instruction himself without lessening mine, as he who lights his taper at candle at mine receives the light without darkening me. The idea should spread from one another all over the globe for the moral mutual instruction of man and improvement of his condition. So that was Thomas Jefferson. Now you might have seen the subheading of this talk was why the Bard, Jefferson and Jane Austen all said yes to research impact. So where's the Bard gone? Well, of course, quite a few people said that Francis Bacon was the person what wrote the plays of Shakespeare. I'm sure that isn't true because he was very busy not only developing the scientific method, but also being the Lord Chancellor of England. Now, the final thing in the Knowledge for Better Health initiative was a framework for assessing health research systems. This suggested there were 4 functions and 9 components. The 4 functions were stewardship or governance, finance, capacity building, producing and using research. Now, this is going to be covered this afternoon, the 9 components. Component 4 that I just referred to, monitoring and evaluation. This stresses impact assessment. So this is, I say, where we came in. The framework has been used to analyze health research systems in various ways. So there's that poster at the back is of some work we did for the WHO Europe to produce a health evidence network report. And you can see that there's quite an attractive poster. So obviously I didn't design it. That was Lucy who designed that, Lucy Kanya, who I think is listening here. And now at NSE. But also more recently with some Canadian colleagues, I used this framework, as my final slide, to be pleased to hear, use this framework to analyze what happened to health research system during COVID. And so we start off by talking about astonishing health gains, averted millions of deaths, so that, you know, there were impact assessments were being done actually at the time the research was being produced, so very soon after, showing all the millions of deaths that had been averted by all the work that was going on. And why was the research so rapid, looking at the practice? So research coordination is all part of the governance or stewardship function. Prioritization. So again, prioritization. In the UK system, over the years, the National Institutes of Health had developed this idea that we're going right back again to sort of Maurice and Mary, that you should prioritize, that people within the system should prioritize research, not just researchers doing, or not just in some cases, researchers doing anything they wanted, but there should be priorities. And so this was so relevant. Now, the prioritization during COVID was intensified beyond anything ever seen before. But I think UK researchers were used to the idea of prioritization. And similarly, ethics was expedited, and so new treatments, dexamethasone was discovered, and some Brazilian researchers also did some work, but good work on this. But it was the UK that really led on this, and partly also it was a capacity issue. Every single UK hospital trust was involved with the recovery trial. And this was because over the years and years, NIHR had built up capacity throughout the whole system. And then there was also extra funding, so that was particularly important for Operation Warp Speed. Now, when we presented these, when I published this, some people got in touch or commented on our paper and said, "You're saying all this about the UK health research system being so wonderful. In that case, why did so many people, more people die in the UK than in other countries?" So, of course, the point is that ignorance, arrogance, really always trumps evidence, sadly. And nowhere was ignorance, arrogance more evident than in the MP for this constituency, and sadly Prime Minister at the time. So sadly, all these people died who need not have died. But so to go back to what we were saying, there is, of course, another area that we were looking at, and this is the national policy responses were often very good, less evident in Brazil, UK, and USA. Arrogant, ignorant, populist leaders. Anyway, but elsewhere, they did save lives. They adopted the policies that saved lives. And partly the health, it's perhaps no coincidence. The examples we looked at are where were the best policies that saved most lives were where there were good health research systems that had emphasized the importance of researchers working with policymakers and civil servants. New Zealand had a brilliant health research strategy. Australia in general, New South Wales in particular, Canada in general, British Columbia in particular, and good communications. Brilliant, Jacinda Ardern, whose approach was summed up in 3 words: science and empathy. There is a link, obviously, good, where there were good leaders, and there were good health research systems also that helped to ensure this evidence was being produced that was then used to save lives. But just to go back overall, final observation, the UK system did, though, produce this research through recovery that the whole world was grateful for. You talk to people everywhere, and they're so grateful that the UK system was set up so that it could produce this research so rapidly. And so, I'm very pleased that I was able to play just some part in helping to sustain this. And so I'm sorry that I've rather overrun, but I'm trying to cover 30 years of work in a bit more than 45 minutes. Thank you very much. Thank you. And now Bryony is going to sort of take over and also, in a sense, sort of hand back. Go backwards. Go backwards. Well, in a sense, go back to where the Payback Framework started.
What do I press?
Well, I was going to do it. You asked me to. Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah. So this is your first slide. Ready.
Right. Hello, I'm Bryony Soper. For those who don't know, Steve advertised me as the Department of Health person. That actually was only true for a very brief 5-year period, during which I was extremely privileged to work with Michael Peckham on the establishment of the NHS R&D program from 1991 to 96. And that really gives me the authority that Steve required to say how the Payback Framework was used by the department during that time and how that influenced, I think, the development of the framework. I've also subsequently done some relevant work with Steve, which I'll talk about later. But Steve said I was going to go backwards. I'm going to go backwards to the beginning, to the original book by Kogan and Henkel in both its editions. And I want to stress 3 points they raised. It's a complicated book, and this is only part of the argument. But what I've picked up is the reason why it was so difficult for central government and the world of disciplined inquiry to collaborate might be found in the complexities of the systems involved. Systems, again, Steve talked about systems. In the workings of exchange and power and the relationship between them, and in the degrees of incompatibility between the cognitive structures and outputs of science and the needs and constraints, and in the light of what Steve's just said about COVID, the cognitive inadequacies, I would add, of government. So complexities of systems, point one, come back to that. The analysis in the 2 editions of the book suggests that a systems approach should be adopted towards health research within a country. Again, a point that Steve made, especially with regard to the WHO framework. And then finally, and really importantly, of the concepts that are relevant when analyzing changes between the 2 editions, the most significant is probably the concept of the customer for the research. And I get to move to that last point first, in fact. I won't read out the quote at the bottom. That's what Steve asked me to put in the publicity for the 2nd edition, but it really makes the point that we found in the department at that time, this work extremely useful. As did others. I think that the House of Lords Select Committee on Science and Technology in 1988, which reported on the need for a more systematic approach to NHS R&D, was influenced substantially by this book. What they said was absolutely crucial. The NHS is inextricably linked with medical research, yet the administrative remoteness of medical research from the NHS is a source of weakness on both sides. No system of research can function efficiently when the principal customer for the research, which is the NHS, has so small a direct input into the initiation of the research program. A really damning indictment of the current arrangements at that time. And they therefore suggested that there needed to be a new approach and advised that there should be a new director of research and development in the department, a new program set up. That director was Michael Peckham. And what he said also resonates with what the House of Lords said, and it shows the scale of the problems that were faced. So I think it's worth looking at these statements he made in 1991, just after he'd started. A research approach has not been brought to bear systematically on issues relating to the effectiveness of clinical practice, the dispersal and use of existing knowledge, the best use of human and other resources, and the contribution of medical intervention to the health status of individuals and the population. Neither has there been a systematic, that word again, attempt to relate important health issues to the national effort in medical research. Innovation in medical research has been driven largely by the intrinsic interests of disease processes by clinicians and scientists, and medical practice has been shaped by the intellectual challenge of clinical problems. And then he identified the challenge that we faced at that point. The challenge now is to introduce a sensible mechanism for handling within the NHS the output of basic and applied research, and to apply research methods to examine the content and delivery of healthcare. No mean task, rather daunting at that point. What was also daunting was money. The estimated resource for NHS R&D at that point, and this was a very, very rough estimate because nobody really knew, was 0.9% of the NHS budget, scattered around. Nobody knew where it was, nobody knew exactly what it was. What Michael Peckham managed to achieve in the first few weeks he was in the department was to get a promise that that resource would be increased to a target of 1.5% of the budget by 2015. But then, of course, the real challenge was to justify the use of these funds. The Treasury wasn't going to release money unless we make a good case for it. How are we going to do that? What was the payback from all this new activity we were going to generate? Who did we turn to? Buxton and Hanney.
Well, Buxton.
Both. I don't want to go over all the ground that Steve's covered. I just asked Martin. Martin mentioned that in 1993, it was the sort of beginning of the payback, the sort of foundation of the payback. That was the year that the Department of Health asked Martin and Hanney to look at this issue. What I want to talk about now, though, is the issue that Steve said wasn't very well covered initially in the work that was done, simply because it was a difficult area to cover, this issue of absorptive capacity and payback. Just a little bit of background here. The concept of absorptive capacity was originally described in the context of industrial research. And it suggested that conducting R&D within a firm helps that firm to develop and maintain its broader capabilities to assimilate and exploit externally available information from research. And it can be created as a byproduct from a firm's R&D investment. I think probably Japan is a very good example of a country that did that extremely well. And it's one of the benefits that the Buxton and Hanney framework identified. When clinicians and managers in healthcare system are seen as stakeholders in the research system, then their engagement in research can be a way of boosting their ability and willingness to use research from wherever it comes. In 2013, Steve and I and Annette was helped by Terry Jones, undertook an evidence synthesis to find out whether research active organizations improve care. Everybody had always assumed they did. Where was the evidence? One of the issues that kept coming up in that was this idea of absorptive capacity. We looked at 15,000 papers, very wide field. We had to narrow it down. We had to focus it. In the end, we found 33 relevant papers, 28 of which were broadly positive. Some of them covered outcomes, but only a few health outcomes. Most of them covered care processes. And then looking at all these papers, we also looked at the wider picture, the context for all this. And we found some evidence that organizations in which the research function is fully integrated into the structure can outperform other organizations. The one that stood out in the literature at that point was the Veterans Health Administration in the United States, who'd done an extraordinary job in ensuring the research function within the administration was associated with all the aspects of managing that administration and its research arm, the query program. The conclusion we came to at the end of this review, having looked at all these papers, narrowed it down, was that when clinicians and healthcare organizations engage in research, there is the likelihood of a positive impact on healthcare performance. We had to be tentative. We hadn't got very much more evidence, but we got some. And IHR, who'd funded this review, tweeted this little infographic, which managed amazingly to reduce all this work. I can't remember how many papers.
151 papers.
151 papers in our report, down to this one page, this one slide, which says what I've just said. We wanted to update this evidence synthesis, and in 2020, the original team got together with a wonderful colleague from Australia, called Belinda Goodenough, who was more than good enough, and the clerks around the country as local regional bases to bring together universities, service providers to work on programs of health. And I think the fact that they were local, they were regional, was actually really important. One of the key elements, I think, in the NHS R&D program originally that got lost with the reforms of the NHS generally was its regional structure, local structure within a wider system. And the clerks replicated that. They were refunded again in 2014, and then they changed to become ARCs, I think because nobody could remember how clerks, how the letters worked in clerks. ARCs are applied research collaborations. They do roughly the same job. Just want briefly, very briefly, to go through some of the findings from these two reviews. Most of these we weren't able to put in the first review, they came later, but research active hospitals definitely showed lower mortality in a study by Ostermeyer and colleagues. And you can see from this slide quite clearly that those who had more research activity have very considerable lower mortality. There was a second study, can we go on to the next one? I don't want to dwell on these, but there was a second study looking at the same issue run by on colorectal cancer. And they found the same finding, that patients treated in hospitals with high rates of research participation had lower postoperative mortality and improved 5-year survival. Now, nobody can claim at this point that there's a causation here, clearly, but there are strong evidences of a fairly strong correlation here. And then other work was done elsewhere about the growing evidence between research active hospitals and higher approval CQC ratings and lower length of stay, both in the UK and also in Spain. So there are beginning to be indications that we have some pretty solid evidence here. As I say, these collaborations, these regional things are part of a wider system, part of what was the NHS R&D program and then became the National Institutes of Health Research. Embedded as it is in relation to the NHS, if you remember the slide that Steve showed from Pang, these two spheres, there's the link between them. They overlap, but the health system is separate from the NHS, but there's a very considerable overlap. And that's the important point. I put in a quote here by Anthony Collier. Anthony Collier is a health economist who was a member of the original advisory committee for the NHS R&D program. He knew the program well. And what he said is, having looked carefully, and he's published recently on this, at the NHS R&D program and what it achieved and what it didn't achieve, his conclusion was all countries face constraints that limit ambition, both for the healthcare system itself and for R&D. Good system design and making the best use of the resources available are always priorities. A very relevant message, I suspect, for the WHO framework. He wasn't suggesting that the NHS R&D program was a model for elsewhere. He simply said, here's a case study. This is what we did in the UK. This is what we managed to achieve with a healthcare system that's got universal coverage at that point. What we did achieve, I think, was not inconsiderable. And what it did lay the basis for, as Steve mentioned at the end of his talk, and this is my last point, is that we were able as a country to not only develop vaccines at pace and at scale, but also to launch the recovery trial. And the figures for this are astounding, really. The world's largest clinical trial for treatments for COVID-19, more than 40,000 participants across 185 sites in the UK, funded by a variety of funders, the MRC, the National Institutes of Health, the UK Research and Innovation. The trial was up and running within 6 weeks of getting the funding. Amazing. Steve mentioned Martin's point about queues. This trial didn't have to wait in a queue. It was so urgently needed, it jumped any possible queue. And it found one of the world's first COVID-19 treatments, dexamethasone. It reduced deaths of hospitalized patients for COVID-19 by a third. And the estimated saving in lives was 22,000 in the UK and 1 million globally by March 2021. It's then gone on since to do further work elsewhere, including in Indonesia and Nepal. But I think it shows what could be done in a research system, in a health research system that had over the years developed and strengthened its connections with the health system in which it was embedded. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bryony. It's great. And it's great that sort of two presentations say more or less compatible things, isn't it?
Did them separately.
Yeah, but just compatible.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. So we're in the second half of our session. And those who are just joining us, we had a very interesting session about Payback Framework, the 30 years work by Martin, Buxton, and Steve Hanney and other colleagues. In this session, we focus on the work that we've been doing with the WHO, following on from the Payback work, leading to strengthening national health research systems, or the NHRSS. Many thanks to Steve and Bryony for the presentation, wonderful presentation. But one thing I want to be very upfront about, and that is I cannot match, and don't expect me to match, Steve's energy this morning. My name is Subhas Pokhrel. I'm a professor of health economics here at Health Economics Research Group. And we'll be joined by two colleagues, Tanya Kuke-Mueller from WHO and Dr. Sushil Baral from Hard International Nepal. And very quickly, this is what we're going to do. So we have just signed the WHO Brunel Framework Agreement, and I will take this opportunity to launch that. And then I'll provide some perspectives, Brunel perspectives about working with WHO. And Tanya will talk about the same thing, but from the WHO perspectives. And then Sushil will come and talk about strengthening national health research systems from a low and middle income country perspective. And we'll have an opportunity for a Q&A at the end. So, as you heard this morning, Herg and colleagues at Brunel have been working with WHO on payback framework and, various other things. And there was an early collaboration with the WHO to develop systems approach to strengthening national health research systems, how you think about research systems to improve the outcomes for health systems. And this collaboration continued. And in 2017 and 19, we supported WHO in reviewing the evidence about, what are the tools, policies, interventions that are effective enough to develop those health research systems in various countries. So on that basis, we realized that it would be actually much more meaningful for both the WHO and Brunel to work together with other partners in low and middle income countries to actually continue to develop that strengthening NHRS agenda. And particularly the knowledge transfer bit, where we have got the knowledge and how do you translate that into policymaking. And increasingly, there has been an interest in understanding the return on investment from just that bit of knowledge transfer. But there's not much evidence at the moment. So that is one of the areas we're looking into currently. But also, together with the WHO colleagues, Brunel can actually think about developing research and implementation capacity in those areas. So, knowing things is important, but implementing them is more important. And therefore, the capacity is needed. And we will be working towards that. So those are the kind of the background against which this framework agreement has been established. And basically, the agreement started in the early this year, but, may I take this opportunity to actually formally launch this agreement. Thank you. Just giving some perspectives from Brunel. So working with the WHO has been really, really encouraging. Initially to develop a systems approach. And what that basically means is that there is a healthcare system that sits alongside wider science system, okay? But in order to get better outcomes for healthcare systems, you need to have a research system established as well. So that integrates into that bigger picture. So taking that whole systems approach and thinking about how we develop that system is important. And Steve was the co-author of that seminal paper about this NHRS. But more recently, in 2017 and 19, we participated in the WHO organized events for Eastern European countries and Central Asian countries, where the countries came together and thought about how best we can actually implement national health research systems, where funding is a key challenge. So in 2017, we presented a evidence review about what is the evidence and policies, interventions, and tools for establishing and strengthening national health research systems and their effectiveness. So it was a very challenging question posed by the WHO for two reasons. One, it was very difficult to actually have a counterfactual against which you can, compare the policies, interventions, tools about NHRS and say, this is more or less effective, right? So it was very difficult to do that. And secondly, most of the papers were produced by the same people who actually were very active in developing that system in the first instance. So there was an element of subjective bias that needed to be ruled out to get that evidence in a proper format. But Lucy, Steve, and Annette actually held this shape up, and we presented the preliminary finding. This is from Sofia. And then 2 years on, we completed the review and then presented the final recommendations. And there were actually, 5 things we said in the report. The first one is that mapping the activities around NHRS in any country is critical. So what is the baseline? So what is happening currently? The stewardship function, which is around developing a strategy, but also its implementation is brilliant. We found that in some countries like Nepal, the NHRS strategy is already there, and this was picked up as one of the best strategy formulated. But the trouble was that the implementation of that strategy was very poor. So that was the stewardship function. And the third thing we said was the stakeholder engagement was critical. So talking to wider stakeholders, and we heard about that in the previous session as well, is very, very important to implement those strategies. Monitoring and evaluation mechanism. So whatever happens in terms of strengthening national health research systems, if we do not actually monitor and have the metrics to evaluate the progress, then we cannot actually make any progress. And finally, and probably the most important, recommendation was to invest in and advocate for inter-country and in-country health research partnership and regional collaboration. And to that effect, Sushil will come in and talk about what is happening in Nepal currently in terms of developing that in-country collaboration. So we have now the framework agreement, and we have got Nepal as the country who is keen to work with us in translating that framework agreement. So at this point, I will invite Tanya to introduce herself and provide the WHO perspectives.
Thanks very much, Subhash, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tanya Kuchenmüller. I'm Unit Head Evidence to Policy and Impact in the Research for Health Department Science Division at WHO. And I'd first of all like to thank Brunel University London, and in particular Steve, for inviting me to speak at the Brunel Research Festival. We are truly delighted to have embarked on this collaboration on national health research systems strengthening with HERG under the leadership of Subhash, as he just mentioned already. So, as I trust was already iterated during the session, to improve population health and achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, we really need to have policies and interventions that are based on high quality research evidence, including locally conducted research, but at the same time also, combining the local with the global. And we also know that the challenge still very much remains in generating and using research evidence effectively for establishing and strengthening national health research systems as a proposed solution. And despite these ongoing efforts, many countries still lack comprehensive national health research systems, policies and strategies to really allow to go for this systems approach. And that was the reason why then WHO and the European region, to further also support member states in this area, commissioned a review that Subhash had already mentioned, the Health Evidence Network review, to really address the question on what the evidence is on policies, interventions, tools for establishing or strengthening national health research systems and their effectiveness. And this report that you see on this slide on the left-hand side was published in 2020 and presents the evidence related to the 4 functions of the national health research system and their operational components on the right-hand side. I won't go into detail here because Subhash has already also alluded to them, but there's the stewardship and governance function, the capacity building, the securing financing, but in particular, 4th function. So the function on the 3 mutually reinforcing components of producing, translating, and using research. That's something that we are zooming into with this project collaboration agreement that we have signed with Brunel University London. Fostering the use of evidence is requiring specific knowledge translation and management approaches that draw on the local, global, available evidence. And at WHO, we have an initiative which is called the Evidence Informed Policy Network, active.The, that drives these processes at country level. And I'm going to speak more about it on my next slide. So on this slide now, just to highlight what active.The is about. So active.The has as a key objective to ensure that high quality, context sensitive evidence is routinely informing health decision-making for country impact. So it's really about creating a culture of evidence use at global, regional, and also at local and country level. The portfolio of work of EVIPNet is quite diverse. So I will only speak here on this slide about 4 key work streams that we are operating on. One is about strengthening country leadership and putting countries into the driving seat by building and institutionalizing their capacity to bridge the research to policy gap. And this very much through establishing and strengthening science advisory bodies, or what we call multidisciplinary and multisectoral knowledge translation platforms. Then another area is through interactive processes and demand-driven approaches, as well as explicit citizens' engagement in deliberations to enhance confidence and trust in science through the work of the network. We have as the third big area, the creation of synergies between globally produced public evidence goods and their adaptation and contextualization, making the evidence thus more relevant and also more actionable at country level. And then finally, the network provides a space for dialogue and relationship building, and also for mutual continuous learning across the evidence ecosystem, and bringing different evidence ecosystem work streams together. For example, the evidence supports work, the guideline development work, monitoring and evaluation. So all these different forms of evidence that are essential for decision-making. How does EVIPNet support member states? And maybe we can turn to the next slide. We are operating at 3 levels. So at headquarters, the Global Secretariat sits in Geneva, which I'm coordinating. And here we look at aligning the efforts worldwide across the 3 different levels, providing support to countries and regions, but also creating new partnerships, developing norms and standards, fundraising. So that's very much the work that we are doing at headquarters. Then at the regional level, in the regional offices, our colleagues, they look into providing country capacity building and further promoting the routine exchange of lessons learned and good practices, also peer support among the countries. And then when we go to the country level, that's really the core, and those are the nodes of the networks, the EVIPNet country teams, or as I said, the knowledge translation platforms that then plan, implement, monitor and evaluate knowledge translation activities at country level, supported by the network and the regional offices and headquarters. So it's very much the task of EVIPNet to sustain and institutionalize these country efforts through the country teams and the knowledge translation platforms. And that we are doing, if we can turn to the next slide, please. So the sustainment and institutionalization of the work, and maybe you can click also another time, Janet, just to have perfect. This kind of institutionalization work at country level goes on the one hand through the establishment of structures, and frequently institutionalization is associated mainly with organizations. But we realized because of member states' demand, who wanted to better understand how to institutionalize and how to move forward, we developed a new framework, institutionalization domains framework, but also process framework, that in fact goes much beyond structures, has 6 different domains. That starts with governance, which refers to a wide range of rulemaking and steering related functions for evidence-informed decision-making, including structures, but also going into, as I said, the rulemaking, the steering. The standards, tools, and norms are extremely important. They allow for sound and routine processes, partnerships, collective action across the evidence ecosystem, and overall support functions from, for example, WHO to the country level to strengthen knowledge translation, but then also strong charismatic leadership and commitment, which often is rather associated with change processes, but is just as important to maintain and institutionalize activities. Not a surprise, of course, is that, as we have also seen in the National Health Research System framework, is again resources, both financial, but also from the human side. So having key competencies in knowledge translation among the country team of EVIPNet at country level and beyond. And then a culture which allows for a common understanding what knowledge translation is, what values can be brought about with implementing knowledge translation, and what can be expected in terms of activities and benefits. So these domains are related to a process maturation framework of evidence to policy institutionalization, and is core of the WHO checklist, a publication that came out last year and that you see in the center of the slide, that can be used for various objectives. So on the one hand, to bring about awareness about the importance of evidence use, but then also if countries are interested in initiating the activities towards further institutionalization, and what kind of policies can be put in place. And then lastly, also, how can countries who have embarked already in institutionalization on this journey, how can they improve or further strengthen some of the processes, and in particular, some of the domains. So we're aiming to apply this tool in our collaboration also with many countries. For example, in Nepal, we're going to hear more about the work of National Health Research System strengthening of Sushil in a moment, but just to say again that we are particularly pleased about the new project collaboration with Brunel University London, and that we're able to technically advance these areas of work on national health research systems, knowledge translation, and also further embarking on our mission in view of supporting countries in this field. So with that, many thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Tanya. Right, that nicely leads to Dr. Sushil's presentation next.
Hi, thank you very much, Subhas and colleagues. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Sushil Baral. I work for organization Cohort International, which is primarily focusing on health systems research over the last 2 decades, working very closely with Ministry of Health and Population, as well as the National Health Research Council and other academic stakeholders. I'm very glad to have this opportunity to talk briefly about National Health Research Systems context in Nepal. Can I have the slides projected, please? The next, please. Thank you very much. I mean, this the approach to strengthen national health system in partnership with Brunel University and a number of other institutions in Nepal. Let me take you to the context. I mean, Nepal is relatively new in terms of its federalized context. There's a massive political transformation from unitary to federal system, which left us 3 tiers of government, federal and 7 provinces, 753 local governments. There is a massive devolution of political devolution of power as well as resources. So it's not simply a decentralization, it's a massive political devolution in the new context, which created a lot of new institutions, policy practitioners, as well as the health system, new context of health systems in Nepal. So while the federalism is progressing with defined core functions across the 3 tiers of government, however, there is ambiguity, clarity in terms of roles and responsibility, and systems in terms of decision-making, particularly on the resource allocation and implementation of core healthcare functions to be fully realized in this new structure. We are in very early years of federalism, so we see a very slow and patchy implementation progress. The defined function of 3 tiers of government basically leaves us the policy formulation largely happening at the federal government level, where the provinces are more on the policy program and coordinating between the federal government as well as local government. But the local government, 753 in number in a relatively small country, quite a large, they are primarily tasked with the implementation, particularly on the basic healthcare services. This is what the delineated functions of the new federal structure in Nepal. Next slide, please. Let me talk briefly about the context, particularly on health systems and the national research systems, where these 2 fit together. Health system, relatively progressive but it comes with a high complexity. It's very complex and fragile in nature because Nepal is prone to a lot of shocks and stressors, including natural disasters, climate change vulnerabilities, disease vulnerability. That impact, I mean, that continuously put health system more under stress and shock, and that require innovative approaches of tackling this level of fragility in health system, which demands a contextually led local research. And we have a national health research system, as indicated by Subhas earlier. We have a very good policy. It is evolving. However, the work is happening in silos. There's a lot of fragmentation in terms of approaches and very less integration between the health systems and the national health research systems. So the capacity is another area, which is, of course, changing over the years as the market had changed considerably. But change is taking place at the minimum level as there is a greater emphasis on the conducting research itself, rather developing the national research capacity where the research can be conducted in a meaningful way and in an empirical way. So the institutional home for NHRS, there is a less clarity. There is a quite a big political economy here in terms of like fund functions and functionaries, where the funds are, and how the functions are delineated across these various players, and how the functionaries are connected in terms of delivering these functions. There is quite a bit of power dynamics going on here. And of course, the funding is one issue, perhaps the biggest issue here, along with the capacity, the local capacity, particularly on the translating evidence to the policy and practice, quite challenging. We have diverse stakeholders, public sector, academia, non-profit, profit-making private sector, but largely uncoordinated actions are taking place. Academia, I mean, we have quite a good number of universities and teaching institutions. However, research has not been mainstreamed in academia, and the knowledge management is relatively weak. We do have different types of partnership over the years, partnership and collaboration. There is a considerable local interest we found here is encouraging in terms of developing partnership. However, the partnership was largely guided till date by the funding opportunities and pretty much dominated with the North-South collaboration, research collaboration. So that may have led to a bit in the shadow, the locally led studies are often been ignored. So the linking locally led studies with the national health priorities had to be fully realized. And again, evidence to the policy and practice. We do have a system, but system rather works in a very ad hoc basis and largely politically driven. There are hundreds of decisions been made on a daily basis, but they are more in political nature, which encapsulate very less amount of evidence synthesis. The weak capacity, and there's quite a bit going on, individual versus organization and system. Next slide, please. So what we are aiming and how are we approaching this strengthening the capacity of national health research system? We aim to develop a contextually tailored to the context of Nepal, which might be relevant to other similar LMIC contexts, strengthening the national health research system, focusing on generating evidence, also using evidence to inform national policies and systems, but also the practices. So we look at the technical aspect of it, how the system can be developed using the technical scopes, the policy, and this wider socio-political context, where we are working with the institutions, systems, and individual. So we look at the capacity across the 3 tiers of government, also at the community, at the individual level, at the system level, and the organization, institutional level. So we rather focus on the co-production of the locally appropriate feasible strategy that help strengthening national health research system and implement the co-created framework along in collaboration with other stakeholders and evaluation and scaling up the successful components. Next slide, please. So this is a broader, the logic framework. We have a number of different processes that go as input. For example, as Subhash earlier mentioned, how important it is to have a mapping exercise done in first place in order to really understand the actors, partnership nature, and the capacity and quite a wider information gathering through the mapping process. Also reviewing the policies and systems at different levels. In order to identify the gaps at the institutional, individual, and the community level, so we'll be undertaking a number of evidence review as well as the key informant interview in order to understand the context. So that another important part in this is the co-creating the implementation strategies with the identified key stakeholders. So I bring the particular importance of engaging community in order to strengthen the national research system, the community which have been often ignored because of various reasons in this process. So we are making sure that we engage them. And implementing a multifaceted evidence use interventions in collaboration with the stakeholders and evaluating it. Also creating a network across the practitioners, not only the researchers, but also the policy practitioners who influence decision-making process. So enhancing these networks will particularly contribute to enhance capacity among the network members and institutions in order to use evidence to inform policy and the practices. So a number of key outputs, I'm not going to read all this thing detail, but I think it's very important that we create a space for policy dialogue forums and identify evidence to policy champions. Because there are a number of different organizations and individuals are involved, but not necessarily there is a harmony. There is a synergy joined up together in order to really identify these champions and move ahead. And the outcome, so what we want to see is the improved evidence to policymaking process with the level of capacity developed across the 3 tiers of government at the individual, organization, and system level. Also sustaining the wider support mechanism to continue the policy dialogue forums and the research network. And finally, they developed the model for a national health research system, which might be implicated in wider LMIC context. So the impact that we would like to aim is a resilient national health systems that basically builds on the evidence-informed policy and continue to deliver equitable, gender-responsive, high-quality healthcare, thus the improved health and well-being of the people. Next slide, please. So this is my final slide. It comes with some takeaways. Since our health systems, the national health and research systems is evolving, so we see this as an opportunity, unique opportunity indeed, to strengthen the overall national health research mechanisms, systems, and unfold the levers to integrate national health systems and the national health research systems together towards a better health outcome. So enhancing capacity at system, institution, and individual level, including community, will gradually lead to the strengthened NHRS. Thus, the locally led research will increase, and the uptake from research findings, evidence to policy will be enhanced. So building on the existing foundation that we have till now will lead to evidence to policy and practice towards improving the health outcomes. And finally, the co-produced model will lead to the sustainability and the longer term high impact with the result. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Sushil.